The chorus of the Ethelgard ascendancy had brought peace to 1,000 worlds. It was a peace that flowed like a gentle tide, a psychic symphony of unity that washed over a new species, soothing the jagged edges of individuality and drawing them into the harmonious whole. The ascendancy did not conquer with fire and steel. They enlightened with resonance and inclusion. Their great, pearlescent vessels, shaped like cosmic nautiloids, would enter a system not with weapons bristling, but with empathic amplifiers glowing, broadcasting the serene invitation to join, to become more than the lonely, frightened solitude of a single mind. To the Ethelgard's history was a record of dissonance, a chaotic cacophony of individual wills clashing in pointless, brutal conflict. Their purpose, their gift to the galaxy, was to end this noise, to weave every voice into the sublime, eternal chorus. They were not conquerors, they were composers, and the universe was their unfinished symphony. For 10,000 years, no species had ever refused the invitation. Some had been hesitant, their single-mindedness a stubborn barrier, but the gentle, persistent hum of the chorus always found a way to soothe their fears, to show them the beauty of becoming a part of something truly grand. Resistance was a concept as alien to them as silence. There was no struggle, only the eventual, blissful surrender to harmony. And then they found the humans. The discovery was an accident, a stray signal picked up by a deep-range resonance probe charting the fallow void between galactic arms. It was a tight-band radio transmission, a primitive, ugly burst of noise, but it was unmistakably artificial. The signal originated from a system designated 34 Orionis Delta, a dying red dwarf star orbited by a handful of frozen, barren worlds. The source was a moonlet of the system's fifth planet, a jagged piece of rock and ice the locals, according to their crude transmissions, called Golgotha. The Ascendancy dispatched an emissary vessel, the harbinger of tranquility, to extend the customary invitation from the perspective of cord-mind Luminar, whose consciousness was a tapestry woven from 1,000 assimilated intellects. The mission was a formality, a simple act of cosmic kindness. The probe's report indicated a low-technology society, a fractured people clinging to existence on a world that offered none. They were likely survivors of some forgotten catastrophe, their psychic emanations faint and sharp with the bitter tang of fear and hardship. Such species were often the most eager to accept the peace of the chorus, to lay down the heavy burden of a solitary, desperate existence. The harbinger was a vessel of art and beauty, not war. Its purpose was to awe, to inspire, to demonstrate the perfection of the Ethelgard's unified design. As it slid into orbit over Golgotha, its crystalline hull shimmering with captured starlight, it began its broadcast. It was not a message of words, but of feeling. It was the psychic resonance of pure contentment, of safety, of belonging. It projected the warmth of 1,000,000 suns, the quiet strength of 1,000,000,000 minds joined in purpose, the ecstatic release from the prisons of fear, ambition, and loss. To every other species, this broadcast had been an irresistible balm, a promise of utopia made manifest. To the humans on Golgotha, it was an attack. They were the forgotten children of a fallen earth, descendants of prisoners, exiles, and rebels who had been cast out centuries ago, just before the homeworld consumed itself in a final, glorious war. They had been raised on stories of coercion, of thought police and monolithic states that demanded the surrender of the self. Their entire culture, forged in the frozen, airless mines of Golgotha, was built on a foundation of spiteful independence. They trusted nothing and no one. And their answer to the Harbinger's gentle song of unity was a scream of pure, unadulterated rage. Luminar watched the event unfold through the fragmented sensory logs of the Harbinger, a recording so horrifying that it threatened to create a permanent dissonance in its own carefully balanced consciousness. The humans had not hailed them. They had not attempted to communicate. They had hidden on the surface of the moon what the Ethelgard had mistaken for mining equipment and communication relays were revealed to be something else entirely. Massive magnetic accelerators, salvaged from the asteroid-cracking machinery used to carve out their subterranean homes. Fired. They did not launch missiles or energy beams, but solid, unguided slugs of refined iron ore, each weighing thousands of tons. It was a brutish, ugly, and ridiculously primitive form of attack. It should not have worked. The Harbinger's kinetic shields, designed to repel micrometeoroids and the stray weapon fire of uncivilized species, flared and buckled under the sheer, stupid mass of the projectiles. The first slug, moving at a significant fraction of light speed, slammed into the vessel's forward empathic array, not with the clean puncture of a directed energy weapon, but with the force of a tectonic collision. The ship's crystalline structure, designed to resonate with psychic energy, shattered. The second and third slugs tore through the vessel's midsection, ripping open entire decks to the hard vacuum of space. The serene harmony aboard the Harbinger was replaced by a chaotic shriek of pain and confusion from the hundreds of Ethelgard crew members. This was their first shock. The second was far worse. As the crippled emissary vessel drifted, its internal systems failing, smaller human ships swarmed from the dark side of the moon. They were misshapen things, patched together mining skiffs and cargo haulers, their hulls scarred and their engines burning dirty chemical fuel. They latched onto the Harbinger's wounded hull like parasites, cutting their way inside with industrial torches. The Ethelgard aboard had no concept of personal combat. Their physical forms were slender and graceful, evolved over eons for contemplation and psychic communion, not for violence. They faced the humans with open hands, attempting to project waves of calm, to ask what was wrong, to soothe the obvious pain that must be driving them to such madness. The humans answered with projectile weapons that spat chemically propelled metal shards, and with long, sharp blades they wielded with terrifying efficiency. The sensory log became a staccato nightmare of images and sounds the Ethelgard collective could barely process. The humans moved in coordinated teams, their faces hidden behind grim, functional helmets. They ignored the Ethelgard's pleas, their psychic projections of peace shattering against a wall of sheer, focused hatred. They swept through the ship, their heavy boots clanking on decks designed for silent meditation. They were not trying to capture the ship. They were exterminating its crew. The log's final moments were a transmission from the Harbinger's own cord mind, a being of immense wisdom and compassion. Its last thoughts were not of fear, but of profound, soul-shattering confusion. It showed a human soldier, armor spattered with the iridescent blood of the Ethelgard, leveling a weapon. The cord mind projected its final offering, a vision of a universe without pain, a symphony of existence. The soldier paused for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, the cord mind felt a flicker of the human's inner state. It was not the cold logic of a warrior or the righteous fury of a defender. It was a raw, burning pleasure in the act of destruction, a deep, satisfying hatred that was an end in itself. Then the soldier fired, and the Harbinger's log went silent. In the silent, data-rich chambers of the core thought, Luminar replayed the final fragments again and again. The chorus, for the first time in its existence, felt a tremor of something akin to fear. The physical loss of the Harbinger and its crew was trivial. a single dropped note in an infinite symphony. The true horror was conceptual. The Ethelgard's model of the universe was predicated on the assumption that all sentient life fundamentally sought harmony and feared dissolution. These humans, they seemed to embrace dissolution. They fought as if their individual lives meant nothing, yet they killed to protect the very individuality that Ethelgard saw as a curse. Their dying thoughts, captured in faint psychic echoes, were not of transcendence or peace, but of bitter, snarling defiance. They had looked upon perfection and had chosen to spit on it. This was not resistance. It was an aberration, a pathology of consciousness itself. Luminar could not classify humanity as an enemy, for an enemy is a dissonant voice that wishes to impose its own melody. The humans had no melody. They were pure, destructive noise. They were a cognitive pathogen, a disease of the soul that had to be cleansed before it could spread. The decision was made not in anger, but with the cold, detached precision of a surgeon preparing to excise a tumor. A sanitizer fleet was dispatched from the core worlds. These were not vessels of enlightenment. They were sterile, functional instruments of eradication, crewed by minds who had willingly dampened their compassion to perform necessary, if unpleasant, tasks. Their purpose was not to conquer Golgotha, not to punish its inhabitants, but to simply and completely erase it, to restore silence to a system that had dared to scream. As the fleet slipped into the void, Luminar felt a sense of grim resolution. The anomaly would be corrected. The symphony would be restored. It did not occur to Luminar, nor to any mind in the vast, ancient chorus, that the pathogen might not only survive the cure, but learn from it. They did not understand that for a species born from chaos and weaned on spite, an attempt at sterile eradication was not a threat, but an invitation to a war they were uniquely built, terrifyingly suited to fight. The sanitizer fleet did not announce its arrival with shimmering beauty or a song of cosmic unity. It simply appeared. One moment, the void around Golgotha was empty save for the cold, distant stars. The next, it was occupied by 7 perfectly black, geometrically flawless vessels. They were sharp-edged dodecahedrons, absorbing all light, their presence a void in the starfield. They were not ships, they were absences, holes cut in the fabric of reality. On Golgotha, in the deepest, most shielded command bunker carved from the moon's iron heart, Warden Jorik watched the tactical display and chewed on a synth leather strap. His face was a roadmap of scars, his one good eye a chip of granite. Beside him, Kaelin swayed, her hands pressed to her temples, a thin line of blood trickling from one nostril. She was a screamer, one of the few on Golgotha whose minds were just sensitive enough to brush against the vast, silent ocean of cosmic consciousness. When the Harbinger had arrived, its song of peace had felt to her like 1,000 honeyed hooks trying to burrow into her brain, to pull her identity apart thread by thread. Her warning, a raw, panicked shriek of, "It wants to eat our souls," had been the only signal Jorik needed to give the order to fire the mass drivers. Now, these new arrivals were different. They did not sing. They projected nothing. And that, Kaelin whispered, her voice hoarse, was so much worse. "It's a void," she breathed, her eyes screwed shut. "They're not trying to add us. They're preparing to subtract." Jorik spat the strap onto the floor. "Let them try." His voice was the grinding of stones. The plan was an act of collective insanity, born of generations of defiance. They could not fight the fleet. The mass drivers were static, their positions now known and certainly targeted. Their pitiful swarm of jury-rigged mining skiffs would be vaporized before they got within 1,000 kilometers. So they would not fight the fleet. They would feed it. When the Ethelgard began their cleansing, it was with unnerving subtlety. No lances of energy tore at the surface. No planet-cracking bombs fell from the sky. Instead, the lead sanitizer vessel, the method of correction, extended a series of long, crystalline pylons, a wave of energy, invisible and utterly silent, washed over the surface of Golgotha. In Sector Gamma, where the O'Connell clan mined the deep ice, the wave hit first. It wasn't a sound or a light, but a sudden, profound cessation. In the command bunker, Yorick watched the biosign indicators for the sector blink out, not one by one, as they would in a firefight or a hull breach, but all at once. Tens of thousands of lives, gone in an instant. Kaylin let out a choked sob. She had felt it. A gentle, psychic pressure. A feeling not of pain, but of unraveling. The minds in Sector Gamma had simply come undone. Their consciousness, their memories, their very sense of self had been neatly and clinically unknotted, leaving behind nothing but empty, biological machines that would cease to function within minutes. It was the psychic equivalent of pouring solvent onto a priceless painting. The Ethelgard were not killing them. They were unmaking them. "Hold," Yorick commanded, his voice a low growl, his knuckles white where he gripped the console. The wave of silence expanded, sector by sector, a creeping tide of oblivion. The Ethelgard were methodical, erasing the human presence with the detached patience of a librarian archiving old, irrelevant texts. They showed no rush, no anger, no pleasure. They were simply performing a function. That was the detail the humans were counting on. Their enemy was not a warrior, it was a technician. And technicians follow procedures. As the silence field washed over the now abandoned mining complex designated Grave Marker 4, the second phase of the human plan began. Deep within the complex, shielded by 20 meters of solid iron and lead, a fleet of their own lay waiting. The Razor Bees, they called them. Tiny, single-pilot craft. Little more than a cockpit and an engine strapped to a massive plasma torch and a set of magnetic grapples. Their hulls were slathered in a crude, ablative mixture of rock dust and frozen human waste, designed not to defeat the Ethelgard sensors, but to confuse them, to appear as nothing more than debris from the cleansing. As the silence field passed over, the bay doors blew open and 200 Razorbees shot from the wound in Golgotha's surface. They did not fly towards the main fleet. Following Kaylin's agonized guidance, she was using her sensitivity to find the weakest, most distracted node in the Ethelgard's local psychic network. They vectored towards the smallest of the dodecahedron ships, the Absence of Dissonance, which held a flanking position. Its role more monitor than active cleanser. The Ethelgard aboard the Absence registered the debris cloud. Their protocols noted it as an expected consequence of the psychic solvent's effect on industrial structures. They did not register the focused, hate-filled minds within the debris. They had no protocols for that. The Razor Bees hit the black hull like a swarm of angry insects. Their torches flared to life, not trying to cut through the ship's armor, but to melt their way onto it, fusing their own ships to its surface. Grapples fired, anchoring them against the cold metal. They were ticks, burrowing into the flesh of a god. Alarms finally chimed on the serene bridge of the Absence of Dissonance. The local cord mind, a being known as Weaver of Stillness, observed the anomaly with mild curiosity. Physical impact. How quaint. It adjusted the ship's kinetic field to dislodge the irritants. But it was too late. From the belly of a dozen of the Razorbees, boarding torpedoes launched. They were crude, brutal things essentially giant, rocket-propelled drills packed with explosives, and 5 grim-faced soldiers. The torpedoes slammed into the hull where the plasma torches had weakened it and detonated, blasting open jagged, ugly holes into the sterile, silent, perfectly ordered corridors of the Ethelgard vessel. The humans came. They were clad in bulky, pressurized mining suits, their faces hidden behind scratched faceplates. They moved with a desperate, animalistic ferocity the Ethelgard could not comprehend. The crew of the Absence were not warriors. They were observers, technicians. They met the intruders with the same placid confusion as their brethren on the Harbinger, attempting to project calm, to understand the source of this chaotic noise. The humans gave their answer with auto-loading shotguns that fired fist-sized slugs of scavenged metal and with powered vibro-axes that had been designed for cutting through rock. The slaughter was immediate and absolute. Yorick was in the lead group, a massive pulse rifle salvaged from their first bloody encounter in his hands. He led his team not towards the bridge, but towards engineering. This was not a battle for control. It was a heist. As his soldiers held the narrow corridors, their backs to one another, firing methodically at the slender, terrified Ethelgard who drifted towards them in a state of shock, Yorick and his technicians worked at the heart of the ship. They didn't need to understand the elegant, crystalline systems of the Ethelgard drive core. They just needed to sever it from the rest of the ship. Explosive charges were placed, interfaces were crudely bypassed, and power conduits were rerouted with heavy, sparking cables. They were not pilots. They were demolitionists. They were not trying to fly the ship. They were trying to steal its engine. From the bridge, Weaver of Stillness finally understood. This was not a random act of violent despair. It was a coordinated, tactical assault with a specific, unbelievable objective. It sent a frantic, dissonant burst of alarm through the chorus, a shriek of pure, undiluted shock that rippled through the sanitizer fleet. The method of correction ceased its cleansing, its silent wave retracting. The other vessels began to turn towards the Absence, but the humans were faster. A series of shaped charges detonated deep within the Absence of dissonance. The ship shuddered violently. A massive section of its aft portion, containing the entire FTL drive and power core, broke away, crudely severed from the main vessel, towed by a web of cables attached to the surviving razor bees. This colossal piece of stolen technology, the heart of an Ethelgard starship, began to accelerate away from Golgotha, a ragged trophy of war. Yorick and his boarding party, their suits spattered with alien blood, rode on its surface, clinging to its hull. They had lost more than half their forces, but they had won the prize. As the crippled dodecahedron tumbled in space and the rest of the Ethelgard fleet stared in horrified disbelief, the humans of Golgotha made their escape. They did not flee back to their dying moon. With the stolen drive core jury-rigged to their largest, most heavily armored asteroid hauler, a monstrous, ugly ship they called the Vengeful Bastard, they pushed out into the black. Back in the core thought, Cord Mind Luminar received the report. The cleansing of 34 Orionis Delta had failed. The pathogen had not been contained. Worse, it had metastasized. It had learned. It had stolen a piece of the chorus's own soul, a piece of their sacred technology, and now, this screaming, violent, incomprehensible race of primitives was loose in the galaxy. They had a working FTL drive, and through the still faintly resonating crystals of the stolen core, the Ethelgard could feel the humans interfacing with it, tearing it apart, not with reverence, but with a greedy, feverish curiosity. They were looking at the drive's navigation logs. They were finding the Ethelgard's star charts. They were learning the pathways to 1,000 serene, peaceful, and utterly unprepared worlds. The symphony had not just gained a discordant note. A rabid animal was now loose in the concert hall, and it had just found a map to the composer's private chambers. The vengeful bastard was less a starship and more an act of cosmic defiance welded together. Its spine was the massive, graceless hull of the Kerberos, Golgotha's largest ore hauler, bolted, fused, and in some places simply chained to its stern was the prize, the entire aft section of the absence of dissonance. The transition between the two was a grotesque scar of scorched metal, hastily sealed breaches, and a chaotic web of power conduits that sparked and fizzed with energies no human engineer truly understood. Inside, the ship was a hive of frantic, desperate activity. There was no serene bridge, only a cramped, sweltering command center where Jorik stood over a makeshift tactical table. The air tasted of ozone and recycled sweat. Kaylin was slumped in a corner, wrapped in thermal blankets, her face pale and drawn. The psychic backlash from the Ethelgard's collective shriek of horror had nearly scoured her mind clean. Yet she was their only long-range sensor, their only way of knowing what the chorus was thinking. They're confused, she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. They don't have a protocol for pursuit. They're deliberating. Jorik grunted. Good. Let 'em talk. Every second the Ethelgard spent in committee was another light year the bastard put between them. His focus was on Anya, his lead engineer, who was practically fused with a terminal that interfaced directly with the stolen Ethelgard drive. Her eyes, magnified by thick data goggles, were wide with a kind of manic glee. Warden, this thing it's not a machine, she said, her voice giddy. It's alive. It thinks. It sings space into folding. They don't fly through the void. They convince it to get out of their way. Can you steer it? Jorik asked, cutting through her awe. Steer it, Jorik. I'm teaching it to curse. We can't control it directly, ahoy. It's all intuitive. Psychic resonance bullshit. But we can suggest things to it. Piss it off. Frighten it. We've managed to splice its navigation matrix into our own. It thinks our destination is its own idea. She pointed a trembling, grease-stained finger at the star chart projected on the main screen. And it's taking us here. The destination was a system designated on the stolen Ethelgard charts as Sanctuary 7. According to the data they'd ripped from the drive's memory, it was a resonance garden, a world where newly assimilated species were sent to acclimatize to the chorus, to gently shed the last vestiges of their individuality in a controlled, idyllic environment. It was a planetary kindergarten for souls. It was also, according to Anya's analysis, one of the most lightly defended systems in the Ascendancy. It's a soft target, Jorik said, a predatory glint in his one good eye. We hit them where they're weakest. We show them that nowhere is safe. We don't have the numbers for an invasion, Anya countered, finally pulling off her goggles. We have one ship, maybe 2,000 fighting personnel, and a stolen engine that could decide to turn itself into a black hole if we look at it wrong. We're not invading, Jorik said grimly. We're educating. The arrival of the vengeful bastard at Sanctuary 7 was an obscenity. The system was home to the Xylos, a gentle, insectoid species who had joyfully joined the chorus a century prior. Their world was a place of crystalline forests and placid, methane seas. Their concept of violence was limited to disagreements over the proper arrangement of dew jewels on their hive chimes. When the monstrous human ship tore a ragged hole in their reality, emerging from a shimmering, unstable fold in space, The local Ethelgard custodians were paralyzed by sheer cognitive dissonance. The ship was wrong. It was a crude, brutalist shape, dragging a piece of their own sacred architecture behind it like a corpse. And it was broadcasting, not a song of peace, but a chaotic, jagged blast of noise. The humans had taken their own primitive radio technology and, using the stolen drive as a power source, turned it into a weapon. They were flooding the system's psychic space with a cacophony of everything the Ethelgard sought to erase: recordings of war cries and heavy industrial machinery, screams of pain and rage, primitive, pounding music full of dissonant chords and brutal rhythms. To the Xylos and the Ethelgard on the planet below, it was a psychic migraine, a wave of pure, unfiltered chaos that made the serene hum of the chorus impossible to maintain. But the broadcast was just a distraction. As the custodians' vessels moved to intercept the source of the noise, the bastard vomited a cloud of smaller objects. They weren't ships. They were boarding torpedoes and cargo containers, crudely modified with small thrusters, all aimed not at the Ethelgard ships, but at the planet. They were an ugly, scattered rain of metal falling towards paradise. The Ethelgard, in their confusion, assumed it was a planetary assault. They moved to intercept the falling objects. To protect the garden world, they failed to notice that several dozen of the cargo containers were not falling, but accelerating, using the planet's gravity to slingshot themselves back out into the system, towards the true target, the system's primary resonance amplifier. It was a massive space station, a delicate, flower-like structure that hung in a geosynchronous orbit. It was the linchpin of the system, the device that maintained the constant, gentle psychic hum of the chorus, keeping the Xylos and all other life in a state of tranquil harmony. It was utterly undefended. Orcs' boarding teams hit the station like a wrecking ball. They didn't bother with finesse. They blew open docking bays and cut through the delicate, crystalline superstructure with mining charges. The few Ethelgard caretakers aboard were dispatched with brutal efficiency. The humans were not there to capture the station. They were there to deliver a package. At the core of the amplifier, where the psychic energies of the entire system were focused, they planted their bomb. It wasn't a weapon of energy or explosives. Anya had reverse-engineered a key aspect of the Ethelgard's cleansing technology. She had created a dissonance charge, a psychic bomb designed not to destroy minds, but to infect them. As alarms finally blared across the station and the Ethelgard fleet realized their mistake and began to race back, Orcs' teams retreated, their grim work done. The vengeful bastard collected its scattered forces and, with its stolen drive screaming in protest, ripped another ugly hole in space-time and vanished. Minutes later, the bomb detonated. There was no explosion, no flash of light, just a single or facially wrong psychic note that echoed from the amplifier and washed across the surface of Sanctuary 7. It was the psychic frequency of pure, undiluted human paranoia. It was the feeling of being watched by unseen enemies, the gnawing certainty of betrayal, the bitter taste of suspicion. It was the cold, lonely dread that had been the constant companion of humanity on Golgotha for centuries. For the Xylos, a species that had never known a single distrustful thought, the effect was cataclysmic. The serene harmony of the chorus shattered, replaced by a rising tide of terror and accusation. Hive mates who had worked together in perfect unity for their entire lives suddenly saw each other as threats. The intricate patterns of their society dissolved into a chaotic scramble for individual survival. They turned on one another. Their delicate limbs, once used for crafting art, now used for violence. The Ethelgard custodians on the surface were just as vulnerable. The infection tore through their unified consciousness, ripping it into terrified, isolated fragments. They experienced true individuality for the first time in millennia, and it was an agony beyond their comprehension. Sanctuary 7. The Garden of Peace descended into a planet-wide riot of madness and fear. The news of the atrocity rippled through the Ethelgard ascendancy, carried on waves of shared horror and disbelief. Cord-mind Luminar felt the feedback as a physical pain, a searing wound in the fabric of the chorus. The humans had not just attacked them, they had not just stolen from them, they had turned the Ethelgard's own philosophy into a weapon. They had used the concept of resonance to spread a plague of the soul. This was no longer an anomaly to be corrected. This was a war, and it was a war the Ethelgard had no idea how to fight. They had built an empire on the premise that all life craved harmony. They had just been proven wrong. The humans didn't want to join the symphony. They wanted to burn down the concert hall and salt the earth where it stood. For the first time, Luminar understood. The humans were not a dissonant note to be harmonized. They were an anti-music. Their goal was not to create their own song, but to bring about a final, universal silence. A new order was given, spreading through the chorus not as a calm, rational decision, but as a pained, angry command. The sanitizer fleets were recalled, new vessels were commissioned, their design shifting from sterile, functional shapes to something more menacing. The Ethelgard were learning, they were adapting, they were weaponizing their grief and their fear. As the vengeful bastard limped away from the chaos it had created, its crew exhausted but grimly triumphant, Kaelin began to scream again. This time, it wasn't a scream of pain, but of raw terror. "They're coming," she gasped, clutching her head. They're not deliberating anymore. They're learning to hate. The Ethelgard ascendancy, for the first time in its long, serene history, learned the art of hate. It was an ugly, discordant lesson, a melody of grief and rage that warped the very fabric of the chorus. The attack on Sanctuary 7 had been more than a military strike. It had been a philosophical violation, a desecration of their most sacred beliefs. The humans had taken the Ethelgard's greatest strength, their psychic unity, and turned it into a conduit for a plague of madness. The memory of the Garden World's descent into paranoid chaos was now a permanent, festering wound in the collective consciousness. In response, the ascendancy began to change. The pearlescent, nautiloid vessels of enlightenment were recalled to the core worlds. The sterile, black dodecahedrons of the sanitizer fleets were repurposed. A new fleet was forged, born from this newfound rage. These ships were different. They were asymmetrical, jagged, their crystalline hulls darkened and reinforced, designed not for beauty or resonance, but for pure, brutal functionality. They were called the Retribution Fleet, and they were crewed by Ethelgard who had volunteered to sever the gentler aspects of their consciousness, to focus the collective's anger into a single, sharp point. They were no longer composers or surgeons. They were hunters. Leading this new fleet was a mind that had named itself Subjugator Vorlog. It had once been a chord mind of immense compassion, a weaver of harmonies. But the psychic feedback from Sanctuary 7 had shattered its serenity, replacing it with a cold, burning clarity. Vorlog understood the humans in a way the rest of the chorus still could not. It understood that to fight a creature of chaos, one must embrace a measure of chaos. To defeat an enemy that weaponized hatred, one must learn to hate even more fiercely. Vorlog's strategy was not one of eradication, but of systematic psychological demolition. It had studied the crude, chaotic data streams from the vengeful bastard's attack. the snippets of human history and culture used in their psychic broadcast. It had found a recurring theme, a central pillar of the human psyche hope. It was this illogical, persistent belief in a better future, this defiant optimism in the face of overwhelming odds that fueled their insane courage. Vorlog's plan was simple. It would extinguish every last ember of that hope. The vengeful bastard, meanwhile, was a ship running on fumes and fury. The raid on Sanctuary 7 had been a success, but a costly one. They had proven the Ethelgard could be hurt, but in doing so, they had kicked the hornet's nest with both feet. Kaelin's mind was a raw nerve, constantly flinching from the distant, angry hum of the approaching Retribution fleet. She could feel their focused intent, a psychic spear aimed directly at them. "They're not just following our wake anymore," she told Horik, her voice trembling. "They're predicting us. They're thinking like us." Horik knew she was right. Their hit-and-run tactics were becoming predictable. They were a single wolf pack trying to terrorize an entire continent, and the shepherds were finally learning how to hunt. They needed a place to rest, to repair the groaning, overstressed hull of the bastard, and, more importantly, to find allies. Their stolen star charts showed dozens of independent systems on the galactic fringe, worlds that had never been touched by the Ethelgard. It was to one of these, a notorious pirate haven called Port Nowhere, that they limped. Port Nowhere was a hollowed-out asteroid, a wretched hive of scum and villainy that clung to the edge of a nebula like a tick on a dog's ear. It was a chaotic mess of unregulated docks, black markets, and private armies. It was, Yorick thought with a grim smile, the most human place they had seen since leaving Golgotha. He hoped to trade some of their stolen Ethelgard tech for repairs, fuel, and, if he was lucky, a few more ships to join his one-ship crusade. But Subjugator Vorlog was already 2 steps ahead. The Retribution fleet did not warp into the Port Nowhere system with a psychic roar. It arrived in absolute silence, its new, darkened hulls blending into the black. Vorlog had learned the value of subtlety. It did not immediately attack the vengeful bastard, which was cautiously making its approach to the asteroid. Instead, it targeted the port itself. Vorlog opened a channel, not to the humans, but to the various pirate lords and mercenary captains of Port Nowhere. Its message was not a broadcast of unity, but a cold, logical proposition, delivered in a synthesized, machine-like voice that mimicked the human's own primitive radio. It transmitted the Ethelgard's internal damage assessments of the vengeful bastard, highlighting its crippled systems and depleted resources. It detailed the exact specifications of the stolen drive core. Then, it made its offer a bounty. Any ship, any technology, any scrap of salvage from the human vessel delivered to the Retribution fleet would be rewarded with resources, technology, and safe passage through Ethelgard space for 1,000 cycles. And for the pirate who delivered the human commander, Yorick, alive and intact, Vorlog offered a prize beyond their wildest dreams, a habitable, unclaimed garden world to be their own personal kingdom. Vorlog concluded its message with a final, chilling addendum. You have 1 rotation to comply. After that, we will assume you have allied yourselves with the pathogen, and Port Nowhere will be sterilized. The message sent a shockwave of greed and fear through the pirate haven. These were not creatures of loyalty or honor. They were opportunists, survivors. The Ethelgard were offering them everything they had ever wanted, and the alternative was annihilation. On the bridge of the bastard, Yorick watched in disbelief as the docking clamps that had been extending to welcome them suddenly retracted. The friendly hails from the Port Authority turned to static. Then, the station's own defense turrets, massive, ugly railguns, swiveled to point directly at them. "What's happening?" Anya demanded, her hands flying over her console. "They're turning on us!" Yorick snarled. He had come seeking allies and had walked straight into a trap laid by an enemy who was learning to fight dirty. The first shots came not from the Ethel Guard, but from the pirate ships that had been docked at the station. Scrappy frigates and heavily armed cruisers, once potential allies, now swarmed towards the bastard like sharks smelling blood. They were a disorganized, chaotic mob, but there were dozens of them. "They're boxing us in," Anya shouted, as the pirate fleet moved to cut off their escape vector. "Kaelin, where are the Ithel Guard?" Jorik yelled. Kaelin was curled into a ball, rocking back and forth. "Watching," she whimpered. "They're all just watching. They're enjoying this." It was the ultimate psychological blow. Vorlag was not just trying to destroy them. It was forcing them to be destroyed by their own kind, by the greedy, self-serving, chaotic nature that the Ethelgard so despised. It was a lesson, a demonstration for the entire galaxy to see. This is what individuality leads to: betrayal, chaos, self-destruction. The bastard fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal. Its few remaining weapon systems spat fire, tearing apart the flimsier pirate ships. Yorick was a master tactician, using the asteroid's debris field for cover, turning the pirates' greed against them by leading them into ambushes. But they were outnumbered and outgunned. For every ship they destroyed, 2 more took its place. The hull screamed as railgun slugs hammered against their failing shields. Fires broke out on multiple decks. They were bleeding, and the sharks were closing in. "Warden, we can't win this," Anya said. Her voice strained. "The drive core is unstable. 1 more direct hit and it'll blow." "Then we give them a show," Jorik said, his face set like stone. He knew what Vorlag was doing. It was a performance, and the vengeful bastard was the sacrifice. But he would not let the Ethelgard write the final act. He opened a ship-wide channel. "All hands, yea," he whispered, his voice calm and steady amidst the chaos. "This is the Warden. It's been an honor. Now get to the escape pods. Head for the nebula before it go dark. Live to fight another day." He turned to Anya. "Rig the core to overload, but not yet. Wait for my signal." As the crew scrambled to abandon the dying ship, Jorik guided the bastard on its final, suicidal run. He ignored the pirate ships and aimed the crippled vessel directly at the silent, watching Retribution fleet. It was a gesture of pure defiance, a final, raised middle finger to the gods who had learned to hate them. From the bridge of its flagship, Subjugator Vorlag watched the burning human ship approach. It felt a flicker of something that was almost admiration for their stubborn refusal to break. But it was a fleeting sensation, quickly replaced by cold satisfaction. The lesson was almost complete. It ordered its fleet to hold their fire, let the pirates finish the job, let the humans die knowing they were betrayed by their own kind. Let their last sight be one of utter, hopeless despair. But Yorick had one last lesson to teach. As the first pirate ships closed in for the kill, grappling hooks firing to latch onto the bastard's hull, he gave the signal. "Now, Anya!" The stolen Ethelgard drive, which the humans had only ever been able to crudely control, finally had its chains released. But Anya hadn't just set it to overload. She had given it a final, malicious suggestion, a parting gift of human ingenuity. The drive didn't just explode, it unwarped. For a fraction of a second, the fundamental laws of physics around the vengeful bastard were repealed. Space twisted, bent, and tore. The pirate ships latched onto its hull, were dragged into the screaming vortex. The fabric of reality itself screamed in protest. Then, with a flash of light that was not light, and a silence that was not silence, the vengeful bastard and the entire vanguard of the pirate fleet was gone. Subjugator Vorlog watched the empty space where its quarry had been. It had not won. Yorick had denied it the satisfaction of a clean victory. He had denied it the lesson. Worse, dozens of human escape pods had been launched under the cover of the final, chaotic battle, scattering like seeds into the dense nebula nearby. The pathogen was not contained. It had been dispersed, and Vorlog knew, with a certainty that chilled the core of its being, that each of those seeds would land on fertile ground, ready to grow into a new, more bitter harvest of war. The hunt was not over. It had just entered a new, more terrifying phase. Years bled into the void. The destruction of the vengeful bastard was not an ending, but a genesis. The escape pods, scattered like dandelion seeds into the swirling gases of the Calibos Nebula, became the stuff of myth. On 100 fringe worlds and in the shadowy corridors of a dozen broken pirate stations, whispers began of Jorik's ghosts. They were not a fleet, but a rumor, not an army, but an infection of defiance spreading through the systems the Ethelgard had not yet pacified. Each pod had contained a spark of Golgotha's spiteful genius, and in the dark, those sparks caught fire. They salvaged wrecked ships, stole from isolated outposts, and taught their brutal, asymmetric tactics to anyone who would listen. Cast out species, runaway colonies, all the galaxy's forgotten children who bristled at the thought of the Ascendancy's sterile peace. Humanity was no longer a single point of failure. It was a decentralized insurgency, a philosophical plague with no head to sever. Subjugator Vorlog had also evolved. The hunter had become an architect. It understood that Yorick's final act at Port Nowhere had been a success. It had shown that individuality, however self-destructive, was a potent force. Vorlog realized that the original chorus, the gentle symphony of assimilation, was an obsolete tool. To control a galaxy that had now been exposed to the human virus of defiance, one needed not an invitation, but a cage. And so, it began the construction of the Concordance. This was the Ethelgard Ascendancy reborn in the image of its enemy, an empire built not on psychic harmony, but on fear and domination. Worlds were no longer enlightened, they were subjugated. Species were not invited to join a chorus. They were conscripted into a silent, obedient legion. The Retribution Fleet became the iron fist of this new order, and at its heart, Vorlog was building its masterpiece, the Null Chorus. It was a weapon of unimaginable scale, a network of psychic amplifiers designed to span the entire galactic quadrant. It would not erase individuality, but suppress it, blanketing trillions of minds in a permanent, dreamless quiet. It was the promise of peace through psychic lobotomy, a final, absolute silence. In the churning heart of the nebula, on a rogue planetoid they had hollowed out and named Spite, the largest cell of human survivors had been working. Anya, no longer just an engineer, but the de facto leader of this new resistance, had spent years studying the scarred, weeping crystals of a salvaged Ethelgard comms relay. She was not trying to break the technology, she was trying to listen to it, to understand the language of resonance it spoke. Beside her, Kaelin was no longer a victim of her psychic abilities. The constant, angry hum of the Concordance had been a forge for her mind. She could no longer just hear the Ethelgard. She could parse their intentions, read the structure of their new, hateful chorus, and find its flaws. And it was Kaelin who found him. Yorick. He had survived. Blown clear in the reality-warping explosion of the bastard, his escape pod crippled. He had been picked up by a slaver ship. He had, in his own grim fashion, liberated them, and for years had been leading the most brutal and effective of the ghost cells, a boogeyman haunting the Concordance's supply lines. When Anya's signal finally reached him, he returned to spite not as a warden, but as a living weapon, his face a mask of scar tissue, his one good eye burning with a cold, patient fire. The reunion was not joyous, it was a council of war. They were outnumbered 1,000 to 1. Their fleet was a patched-together collection of garbage haulers and repurposed pirate cutters, but they had one advantage. Anya had built her own bomb, working with Kaylin. She had learned to do more than just create a single, jarring note of paranoia. She had learned how to record and amplify the full, chaotic spectrum of the human condition. It was a dissonance cascade device, designed to introduce not just one emotion, but all of them: love, despair, ambition, loyalty, jealousy, artistic inspiration, petty grievance, and existential dread. It was a weapon that fired pure, unfiltered life. Their target was the heart of the new empire, the primary command and control nexus for the Null Chorus, a colossal star-forged ring under construction in the Xylos system, the site of their first great atrocity, now a symbol of Ethelgard's brutalist power. It was a suicide mission, and every soul on Spite volunteered. The final battle was a masterpiece of human insanity. The Ghost Fleet, barely 50 ships strong, warped into the Xylos system on a dozen different, uncoordinated vectors. They did not attack the Retribution fleet that guarded the ring. They attacked everything else. They crashed ships into sensor arrays, detonated warheads inside asteroid fields to create clouds of shrapnel, and broadcast thousands of fake distress signals, turning the Ethelgard's rigidly ordered battle space into a swirling chaos of false targets and emergencies. Under the cover of this madness, a single, heavily shielded ship, a salvaged ore frigate named Last Regret, made a beeline for the central hub of the ring. Yorick stood on its bridge. He had no grand fleet to command, only this final, desperate charge, Subjugator Vorlog, from the command throne of its flagship. The final silence watched the chaos with cold contempt as it recognized the pattern, the irrational, suicidal tactics. This was Jorik's signature. It ignored the feints and focused its entire will and the firepower of its capital ships on the Last Regret. Lances of black energy tore through the void, hammering the small frigate. Shields buckled. The hull ruptured, but it did not stop. Yorick was using the bodies of his own ships as cover, a trail of wreckage to shield his final approach. Through the psychic ether, Vorlog reached out, its consciousness a blade of pure, cold logic. Your struggle is meaningless, human. You offer only noise. I offer the quiet that comes after a scream. Why do you resist peace? Yorick stood on his burning bridge, his crew dead or dying around him, and smiled. He keyed his own comms, not to Vorlog, but to the device Anya had built in his ship's core. Through a psychic amplifier jury-rigged by Kaylin, he sent his reply, a thought projected not as words, but as a pure concept, aimed directly at Vorlog and the core of the Null Chorus. Because the silence is empty, and the scream means we're still alive. With his last breath, he slammed his fist down on the activation stud. The dissonance cascade fired. There was no explosion. From the wreck of the Last Regret, a wave of pure, concentrated existence washed out and struck the Null Chorus. And the Null Chorus, designed to amplify and broadcast a single, perfect note of silence. Instead, amplified everything. For the first time, every mind in the Ethelgard Concordance felt it, not as an attack, but as a sudden, brutal awakening. They felt Yorick's final, defiant satisfaction. They felt Anya's grief-stricken pride. They felt Kaelin's sorrowful relief. They felt the terror of a dying pilot, the fierce love of a mother for a child she'd never see again, the flash of a forgotten, happy memory, the bitterness of an old betrayal. Every joy, every sorrow, every hope, and every fear humanity had ever known was broadcast into the soul of the chorus. The rigid, hateful harmony of the concordance could not withstand it. The single unified mind, already strained and corrupted by the introduction of hate, shattered under the infinite complexity of true feeling. The great symphony did not end. It broke apart into a trillion individual notes, each one a frightened, confused, and suddenly solitary Ethelgard mind, reeling from the sudden, terrifying burden of being an I. The war was over. Humanity had won. They looked out from the bridge of their few surviving ships at a galaxy in shock. The Retribution fleet drifted aimlessly, its crews paralyzed by the cacophony of their own newfound inner voices. The Concordance had crumbled in an instant. There would be no victory parades, no conquered territory. Their prize was simply the continued, messy, glorious, and terrible right to exist. They had not brought peace or enlightenment. They had given the galaxy the same gift they had always given each other, the freedom to be beautifully, tragically, and defiantly alive. The silence was broken forever, and in its place was a new, chaotic, and terrifyingly vibrant song. And the universe, for the first time, was listening.